Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Dropping the Gloves. We got a good one today, Tim. Friend of the show, Jason Gregor, joining us. But before we get to Jason, this episode is brought to you by Bet365. Proud sponsor, Dropping the Gloves. Open an account with Bet365 today and bet on a huge range of markets. So whatever the sport, whatever the moment, whatever the whatever, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Use code HOCKEYCA. You like that, Jason? It's a good one.
Whatever, man. Great.
Everybody's got to bet on something. Enjoy it. Use our code HOCKEYCA. All right, Jason, welcome back to the show, my man. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. You guys doing great. Enjoy your pod.
Well, we were just saying before we started taping that Jason does 1,000,001 shows, and it's just such an honor to have him on because he's a highly coveted gentleman these days. What happened? Why is everyone drinking the Gregor Kool-Aid these days?
You know what? I wish my wife felt the same way. That'd be unreal. But, you know what? Hey, the team that I've covered for many years is in the Stanley Cup final, so I think that has a little bit to do with it.
You're a encyclopedia of Edmonton knowledge and all knowledge. When we had you on last time, I was blown away by the amount of information you know. What kind of how do you get that information? Do you just constantly consume stats and articles? How do you go about just preparing?
Yeah, I'm a big reader. I like to read. I'm curious. I think I'm always looking for kind of different stats, and whether it's Edmonton, but obviously doing the rundown with Frank, I like to be across the league, and so that's really why I started that. It's because it kind of forces me to look at other teams, and the Panthers obviously now, and I've always kind of have a good memory, so. My wife would say it's annoying, but I can remember lots of stuff, and so that helps. But I just have a real passion for it. Probably started when I was young. My mom and we had back then. I was a kid, but the paper used to get delivered to your house, and so man, I used to read the sports page. Me and my brother, and would fight over, and whoever got it, and the other guy would read the comics, and every now and then you'd have to read about the city. It was like shoot me, but. It just kind of started then, man. I read and read, and so I'm just kind of used to it. Like I get up in the morning and I'll read lots of different articles, and then I always try to research some stat that I find interesting that I think other people might find interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing. You are good at what you do. And you just mentioned before we came on, we were chatting, you just interviewed Ken Holland, GM of the Edmonton Oilers.
Yeah, it's going to come out today on the Nation Network. We had a one-on-one yesterday just talking about his, what led to them in 5 years getting to the Stanley Cup final.
That's interesting because Edmonton's usually pretty closed off. We've talked to players like, yeah, come on the show, and they agree. Then all of a sudden they have to run it by the uppers, and they always say, oh, sorry, we can't. We're not allowed to do podcasts. We're not allowed to do this and that. So to get the GM to open up with you for a sit down is pretty neat. Any tidbits you want to drop on our viewers?
Well, the real one that I probably hadn't heard was how after his first year, they really looked analytically at what their team was lacking. And you got to remember when Ken took over, the Oilers had finished, they'd missed the playoffs 12 of 13 years. And even with McDavid, they'd only made the playoffs once in 4 years. They'd finished 23rd and 25th in his 2 years prior. So, they didn't have a really good team. If you go back and look at that roster at the end of 2019, it's like, oh my God, there's only, 4 players left over. They had a few draft picks that have come up too, but he really said they looked analytically at their team was good off the rush, but they were bad off cycles. And he said, if you're ever going to win, you got to be able to cycle the puck and, obviously produce off the rush. So they targeted 2 guys in Fogle and Hyman, who are both in the top 5 in that one department. And obviously Zach Hyman has been an absolute, it's one of the best free agent signings in history, right? Like, yeah. And Colin and Holland did go on to say, he goes, hey, sometimes you got to get lucky. And we were lucky that Zach Hyman chose to come to Edmonton, and obviously having McDavid and Draisaitl, which is not, that's not Holland's doing, and he admitted it. But, sometimes you need a little bit of luck along the way when you're building a team. And, Zach Hyman's come in and, I'm not sure anybody thought that he would, score 50, but I give Hyman a lot of credit, guys. Like he's worked really hard. He's not just a guy who skates on the ice with Connor McDavid. Like he, obviously it helps playing with McDavid, but he's worked really hard at being a better finisher around the net. Like he, John, you played, and I think sometimes you can get distracted in thinking I've got to do everything well rather than really hone what you do well. And that's what Hyman did. He's not going to be like, hey, I'm going to carry the puck off the rush, or I'm going to work on my slap shot. Like he's like, I got to work on scoring goals from 10 feet around the net. And that's what he's done. And he worked on his foot speed too.
Yeah, I noticed how his confidence has skyrocketed joining Edmonton. With Toronto, he was pretty much meat and potatoes, go in the corner, bang it out, get it to Marner or Matthews or whatever. He's controlling the puck a lot now. He's confident going behind the net, wheeling, making plays. But yeah, his 10 to 15 foot game, it's really, really improved. He was a 5 foot guy for a lot of years, but he's really good. And do you think that's because of McDavid and Holland and these guys challenging him, or he just noticed that was needed?
I've talked to Zach about it, and he, every summer he looks and says, okay, what's one area I can improve on that falls within the skill set of what I have, right? Mm-hmm. And so he says, you always got to work on being quicker. I don't care what position you are. Like, even McDavid gets quicker. People probably forget that, but he really worked on controlling the puck better, and he wanted to work on his hands in tight. Like, it's a skill set to be able to go forehand, backhand, upstairs, right? Or how to cycle. If you see it now in the playoffs, he's added kind of a new move here in the postseason. I've seen a lot more of, where he gets the puck and he shields it. And I think he's learned that a little bit from Draisaitl. It kind of reminds me of Peter Forsberg and Jagger, how, they stick their rump out and they back in, and guys, you can't reach. You defended, John. Like, the guy sticks out. How do you get him? And so he's really learned to do that, but also with the Mohawk eagle turn that he uses on the one skate to allow to come out of the corner a lot quicker. And so, you know what? He's always introducing new elements to his game. And I think it's a great example for people to, the NHL isn't a development league per se, but you always got to keep developing if you want to stay relevant in the NHL.
Now, you mentioned Ken Holland. He came into a team you said was not good. They had Draisaitl, McDavid, Hopkins, obviously, but then it was really empty cupboard after that. The thing they did have was a pretty, good decor back then. Up-and-coming young guys. Can you speak to, because, again, we talked before you came on about how he loses arguably his top two defensemen right out of the gate with Oscar Klefbom and Adam Larsson just going for nothing, and how he recovered from that.
Yeah, I think sometimes that gets overlooked because everybody's like, well, you had McDavid, you should just win. Well, McDavid only plays 21 minutes a night, right? So what else are you going to do? And if you don't have defensemen, you can't win in the NHL. It's been proven. And so Klefbom and Larsson and Nurse, those were their three guys, with the three forwards when Holland came in. And you're like, all right. So his first year, COVID comes at the end of the first year, right? Then they have the delay. So Klefbom's playing. He's always had shoulder issues, but that year it got worse, and that was the end. His career ended after COVID. He played in the bubble, barely played in the bubble. Like, he played, but he wasn't good. He had one arm, so he had to retire. There's like, how do you prepare for that? It's not like, hey, we think this guy's going to be in 3 years a free agent, so we have to have a plan. Klefbom was in his mid-20s. He should have been playing for the next 7 years. He was on a really good contract at $4 million. You're like, this is awesome. So he's out. That happened. He finishes, what was that, October of 2020. Then they come in the shortened season, and Adam Larsson's father and mom, they come to visit. He's super excited. They get off the plane. They're at practice. He's going to meet him at home afterwards. His dad has a sudden heart attack and passes away in Edmonton. And you know what? That had happened earlier, the year before. But then when Larsson was a free agent, his mom is just like, Adam, I can't come visit you. Like, Edmonton's just too emotionally hard for me. And Larsson hummed it, like, it was. I've talked to Adam about it. It was a really hard decision. He ultimately chose Seattle just because he was like, you know what? I need a break, not from Edmonton, the hockey team, but just from the city. It's a bad memory of my dad, and my mom's never coming here again. And so now all of a sudden in 10 months, your top right defenseman's gone. Arguably your top left defenseman's gone. And now you got to try to replace them. Well, there's all this pressure of, you got McDavid and you got Draisaitl. So you know what? They brought in Cody Ceci, and he's not Adam Larsson, but he's been decent, right? He's had some up and downs. He's had some really good years, and he struggled in this playoffs. Kind of, I think, symbolizes it. Ceci struggled to start, but since Game 5 of the Vancouver series, he's been excellent, right? He's only been on the ice for 2 goals against 5-on-5, and he's playing 20 minutes a night. So he's been good within what you want. And it took him a while. They brought in Duncan Keith for a year, and Duncan Keith actually really helped the Oilers' culture and understanding of the pressure of the playoffs. And, they got to the conference final with Keith, and they didn't win. Colorado was a wagon. They weren't going to beat him anyway. But Evan Bouchard got to learn with Duncan Keith. And if Evan Bouchard's a pretty quiet guy, but if you want to get him excited, you ask him to talk about what he learned from Duncan Keith, and he raves about it. And then the big final move was the Hyman free agent signing, of course, but then the Ekholm trade. Yeah. Right. And so like, you think about it, Klefbom left at the end of the 20 season, And to find a real replacement, you had Duncan Keith, who was a stopgap, and he wasn't as good. He was late in his career. But then you got Ekholm for Barrie and 2 draft picks, and they've taken off since then, right? But it shows you it's not just, you can't just go out and find top 4 defensemen, at the snap of a finger. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and you mentioned the revamping of the defense. It just sprung to me that this team wins differently nowadays. They don't go out and blow out teams 7-6, not blowing them out, but just outscore them. It was a horse race last year and the year before that where they had no defense and it was just first team to 7 wins. They're winning 2-0 games, 2-1 games, 3-1 games. Do you think this is an organizational shift? McDavid's, being more responsible, Draisaitl, the Nuge, or is it just they're better defensively?
Well, I think it's a combination of a few things. Number one, I think the players, the coach can have the best defensive system in the world, John, but if the players don't buy into it and don't commit to it, you're not going to win. And when they lost last year, I think to a man, they realized, they beat them, not a knock to Vegas, but if you go back and watch that series, look at how many gift goals the Oilers gave Vegas, right? Like just a pizza up the middle or not picking up your man when that should be very simple to do. And it's hard to be good defensively all the time. It's a commitment. And so I think the players, if you listen to all their core guys at the end of last year, like they knew they kind of, Colorado, they weren't as good as Colorado. They weren't going to beat them, right? Yeah, they're banged up with Draisaitl and Nurse, but even 100% healthy, they weren't beating Colorado. So, and maybe rather than looking at we couldn't beat Colorado, they didn't look at the fact that how they lost was they still gave up too many goals. So then they come the next year and they improved defensively. I'll give them that. They improved defensively under Woodcroft that year, but they still weren't consistent enough. And it ultimately, I think it came into the players. They bought in. Having Ekholm really helped. Brett Kulak's been another addition, guys, that probably gets overlooked. Like, they gave up a second rounder in William Lagesson, and Brett Kulak, like they joke about in Edmonton, they call it playoff Kulak. Like in the playoffs, that guy's money. And he's been good in the regular season too, but in the playoffs, like when he's your number 5, he's a really good 5. And lately now he's playing the right side here, which he's never played with Darnell Nurse. And they've been a pretty good pairing the last few games of that series against Dallas. So you know what? That's been good. But I'd say it's your star guys kicking in. And then really the final change, because to win or even to get to the Cup final, because they haven't won anything, is you need lots of steps. And hiring Chris Knobloch and Paul Coffey. And I think a lot of people are like, Paul Coffey, greatest offensive defenseman ever, maybe. But he's come in and really, like Ekholm, I thought said it well. Dave Manson really honed in on them to be tougher defensively, like work in the corner. You need that battle level. But what Coffey did when he came in and said, guys, we're done just flipping the puck out of the zone. We're making plays. And I don't care if you're Vincent Desharnais or you're Evan Bouchard, I expect you to make plays. Now, Bouchard's obviously like giddy up. That's, that's his wheelhouse. But guys like Desharnais and others, the emphasis was to move the puck. And so now Edmonton spends less time defending, which makes it easier for anybody because they get the puck out of their zone better.
I mean, Edmonton has just been so good the last 3, 4, 5 months that it's easy to forget this team was 2-9-1 back in the beginning of November. How do you explain how this team just turned around from one of the worst starts ever to heading to the Cup Finals?
Well, a combination of things. Number one, the coaching change, right? Like Knobloch, I think there was a lot of pressure, right? They got off to a terrible start. And like this was, it's Draisaitl had said it and he walked it back a bit, but he said, hey, it was cup or bust. So now you're 2-9-1 and you're thinking, oh my God, like we might not even make the playoffs. And there was a lot of internal pressure, a lot of external pressure. And Knobloch came in and just, I think, kind of calmed things down, right? He made the change with Coffey, but he also made a few other changes. He put Mark Stewart in charge of the penalty kill. Mark Stewart had never ran a penalty kill before, but look at their penalty kill guys. Like in the playoffs, it's unreal. Right? Like when you're 100% in the first round and the third round, and you allow 3 goals on 23 kills in the second round, you're pretty damn good. And so that's helped. But then I think the players kind of exhaled a bit too, and they started playing up to their potential because they had a lot of the pieces, right? Like they've made some deadline acquisitions since, but they were a good team. And really for the final 70 games of the season, Edmonton had the best record in the NHL. They went from 31st over 12 games to first over 70. And it's funny how when you think about do the math, John, you're a math guy. What's more important, 70 or 12? But a lot of people couldn't forget the 12. Yeah. They almost overlooked how good they were for 70 games.
Yeah, and the other thing too is we've been pretty critical of Stuart Skinner on this show, and it seems like he's just been he's due for like a bad game, getting pulled once or twice a series and just costing them the chance to win. But he seems to be getting better as this playoff goes on, and obviously he was huge in the Dallas series. What's the confidence level as an organization in Stuart Skinner entering the finals?
You know, Stu Skinner is one of those unique guys that you like to talk to because he's very honest. If he has a bad game, he owns it right away. You know what? I got to be better. Right? Like the Tampa Bay game earlier this year where the Oilers, I think like Vasilevsky was unreal and the Oilers still scored 5 goals on him, but Tampa Bay had 6. And you know what? Skinner came out and said, everybody on our team should be happy except me. I let us down. I didn't play well enough. And this is a young guy, right? Like he's not old. It was his like first full year, second year as a starter. And he's putting that on him. And so he works a lot on mental toughness. And I think that's helped him. You know, you guys mentioned the Vancouver series, and you know, obviously he wasn't playing as well as he would have liked in those first 3 games, and they're down 2-1. And Chris Knobloch, who is not afraid to make changes, goes to Calvin Pickard, who had never played a playoff game in his life, and Pickard was solid. You know, he won Game 4, lost Game 5, wasn't bad. But then since they come back to Skinner, those 2 games and the 6 in Dallas, he's 6-2 in those games. He has a 181 goal, 1.181 goals against. He has a 919 save percentage. He was the reason they won Game 6, right? They got outshot, whatever it was, 34-10, 34-10, right? And he only allows the 1 goal in that game. And you know, we saw it against LA. They won 1-0 in a 33-13 performance. They got outshot then by 20 shots. So you know, Skinner he's not your like proven top 10 goalie at the start of the year, really at any point, but he did have really long stretches where he played excellent. And then he would have a little bit of a hiccup. And I know a lot of people looked at last year's playoffs and then the start of this year and like, oh my God, they could never win. And you know, I'll give Stuart Skinner credit and Knobloch, you know, because they let him reset, right? And just said, hey man, like we believe in you. And the Oilers weren't going to beat Vancouver with Calvin Pickard. I firmly believe that. Pickard wasn't going to come back and win in Game 6 and 7. No knock to him, but he's not Stuart Skinner. And Pickard did his job, which is what you need in the playoffs. You need everybody to pull on the same rope. But ultimately, Skinner came back and has performed well. Now he's going to have to do it again, guys, in the Stanley Cup final, which is even bigger stage. So, you know, we'll see. Because what he did in the conference finals is great, but as we all know now, it means nothing once the Cup final starts.
Now, a guy that is leading your team in scoring, leading the NHL in scoring, could win the Conn Smythe if Edmonton, you know, wins the Cup. I think he's struggling. Connor McDavid. Do you think that he is playing his best hockey right now, getting the point output that he should get? Because it feels like to me, and maybe I'm the only one, where I watch these games, a lot of flash a lot of times, not a lot of substance. And then he gets a couple assists, gets a couple, you know, great plays, but he has so many chances, so many opportunities where I'm just like, what's going on with Connor? Do you have any inside information why he's not finishing? Am I crazy to think that he has another level, even though he's leading the league in points?
Yeah, well, he's been dealing with an oblique injury. I think it's hampered his shot. Like he went from 64 goals to 32 goals. And, you know, if you like, I actually saw in the last 3 games against Dallas, he was shooting way more than he had earlier. And I'm wondering if maybe it's starting to feel a little bit better. This week off will probably help him. Like it's not something, well, there's a difference between hurt and injured, right? Yeah. Like you can play through one, the other one eventually is really going to hamper you. It doesn't limit his skating ability that much, but even if you notice McDavid's burst that we've seen isn't there all the time. And, you know, talking to guys who know way more about how the body works and your oblique muscle and what it's going to, you know, is it going to hurt you when you're shooting at times? Probably. You'll see him mishandle the puck sometimes, but I thought the Dallas series, like the first 2 rounds, Draisaitl was their best player, followed by Evan Bouchard. In this 3rd round, I thought McDavid was their best player. He came up that obviously the goal he scored in Game 6, phenomenal. His defensive awareness has improved a lot. I think Draisaitl, if I had to vote today, though, leading into the final, I'd still have Draisaitl slightly ahead of my Conn Smythe over McDavid because I look at all 3 rounds, right? And I think over the 3 rounds, he's been better. But McDavid really picked it up the last 3 games against Dallas. And now with this rest, I think that's going to help him even more. But his shooting hasn't been at the level last year. And I do think the oblique, you know, nagging issue is probably part of it.
So the Oilers have had a huge advantage down the middle. Every single series, you got McDavid, Draisaitl, Henrique. it's murderer's row. Going into Florida, they can throw out some pretty good centermen as well with Barkov and Bennett, and Lundell has played fantastic in the playoffs. So where's the advantage for the Edmonton Oilers? Because the Panthers are smothering Jason. They puck possess. They're lights out 5-on-5. Their PK's really solid. Their PP's playing pretty well. And then they have Sergei Bobrovsky. Their defense, Gustav Forsling is coming out party. Where does Edmonton find an advantage versus this team?
Well, I still think they have advantage down the middle. Like, as good as Barkov and Bennett are, they're not McDavid and Draisaitl, right? Like, I know everybody's like, look at Barkov and what he did to Zibanejad. I'm like, you're right. He was great, but he was also
Zibanejad sucks.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say Zibanejad's not McDavid. And Barkov in that series, if I'm not mistaken, was 1 goal for, 1 goal against, like against Zibanejad. So it wasn't like, oh my God, you murdered him. So now I will say this: if Barkov can go even against McDavid 5-on-5, that's a big win for Florida, right? But the advantage, obviously, Edmonton is like, Florida's power play is okay; it's 23%, but Edmonton's is 37%, right? Edmonton's penalty kill, Florida's is good, Edmonton's is better, and it's not just that they're limiting goals, guys. Their penalty kill, I would argue, their penalty kill has actually been better than their power play in the postseason. Dallas hardly got any zone time. They couldn't get in the zone. Like, Edmonton's very connected on their penalty kill. So I think and the other thing is, Florida has taken a lot of penalties. They were the most penalized team in the NHL because that's their game. Like, they love to get in your face and play rough. And so people are saying, well, although against the Rangers, they did only take 15 penalties. Like, 2.5 penalties a game isn't a lot, right? So they were actually a lot more disciplined, like I thought, against the Rangers. So they're going to have to find a way to stay their abrasive style, but not take too many penalties. Because even if you say, like, okay, we'll go 4-4 penalties every game, Edmonton's going to say, sure. Because like, their power play is historic. It's the greatest power play over a 5-year span we've ever seen. Last year was the best we've ever seen. So if, like, look at Dallas, the first 4 games, they only took 6 penalties. Edmonton didn't score. And the series was still 2-2. Then in game 5 and 6, they took 5 penalties. Edmonton scored 4 times. And that was basically the difference, right? Like, so with Florida, can you not only stay disciplined, but can you limit their power play? So I think the advantage Edmonton still has is their power play is good, and they've improved 5-on-5. Florida does possess something that I believe Florida's forwards are the most aggressive forward group in the NHL. And I think, Vancouver was aggressive, but they were big and heavy on the back end, right? Yeah. And they pounded the Oilers forwards. I think Florida, it's going to be a real challenge is, how does Edmonton's defense handle it? And Matthias Ekholm, I thought he had a really good point. He admitted that, you know what? Hey, Florida comes at you, you're going to have to be on your toes. But the difference is, like, Vancouver, Dallas, and LA, none of them really attacked, right? Like, they didn't press the Oilers. Florida's going to attack because they have to. I don't see them changing. They've never played a passive style. So Ekholm says the key is then, when you're able to make that first pass as a defenseman, you should be able to jump in the rush. Because even if you made a great outlet pass against Dallas, they still had 4 guys back. And you're like, well, shit, I can't really do anything. But as a defenseman. So that was an interesting one that I'll watch for. Is like, Evan Bouchard can obviously join the rush. Nurse is a great skater. Will we see Edmonton's defense, if they can get by that first wave, will we see them jumping up and having more odd man rushes? Like, I love this series, guys. I think it's going to be a really close series. I think it's, but if it gets down to 6 or 7 at the end of it, I would bet on the best player, because usually the best player, when you have equal depth, when you have the better players, you usually have the advantage.
So Sam Reinhart.
Well, Zach Hyman will say hello to Sam Reinhart and say, hey, like, how about that, eh? We haven't seen 2 50-goal scorers head-to-head in a Stanley Cup final since 1994, 3, I think it is. So yeah, that's something we don't see either.
The one thing I'm interested to see is if Edmonton can play that type of game. The Vancouver series was physical in some ways. Zadorov obviously brings a lot of that, but their forwards weren't aggressive at all, like you mentioned. They were fast, they were feisty a little bit, some lines, but not across the board. This Florida team, and Tkachuk touched on it, everybody touches on that. Every line plays the same way. They forecheck, they hit, no shifts off. They're in incredible shape. Do you think Edmonton has do they got the balls to hang in there and battle and go into the dark spots, the dirty places that most guys don't want to go?
Yeah, like, I think they do, but I'm really curious about how Chris Knobloch what's his matchup going to be? We know that in Florida, Barkov's going to go up against McDavid's line, right? Yeah. Like, that's, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So then it's the Draisaitl line is going to go up against Sam Bennett and Tkachuk.
Bennett, yeah.
But the last series, it was McLeod and Perry with Draisaitl, whereas prior to that, it was Holloway and Kane. Now, Evander Kane, he's kind of a wild card for me in this series. He hasn't had a great playoffs. I know he's been banged up, but against Zadorov, Kane was the one guy who will stay. Like, Kane's very arrogant on the ice. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. He believes, hey, no one intimidates him. I'll fight Reeds. He's not going to be intimidated.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's a lot of the verbal, John, like people still think intimidation isn't part of the game. Like you try to get guys off their game. Tkachuk can make Pasternak fight him for God's sakes. That's how good he is at getting people pissed off. And Kane, when they played Calgary 2 years ago, Kane basically took him out of the series, right? We didn't see Tkachuk after. Now, he said he was a little bit banged up, so maybe that was part of it. But I'm curious if they go Kane with Draisaitl and whoever the other winger is, just because that Bennett and Tkachuk are going to be going after Draisaitl, as they should, right? Now, Draisaitl's not a shrinking violet. He's big, he's heavy, he can play in the dirty areas that you talk about, but I don't think he can do it on his own. Ryan McLeod, that's not his game. So is McLeod maybe better to play with Henrique and Perry or Fogle to try to go up against that Lundell line? Because that's a really good third line. Like, I like Anton Lundell a lot.
Yeah.
Right. So that to me is kind of where we see the matchup game. And because if you spread it out, it's nice. But if it's me, I'd probably start Kane with Draisaitl, because I know that Draisaitl is going to get a double dose of Bennett and Tkachuk, and they're going to be in his face all the time. And not that he can't handle it, but you know how it is, John. If it's 1-on-2, it's a lot harder than if it's maybe 2-on-2. And I'm not sure Corey Perry has the speed in his game to play. If there's scrums, Perry's in there. We know that. But does he have the speed to do it? I wonder.
Yeah, and he's not. I don't. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, just one more question from me, and then we'll wrap up with some rapid fire questions. But Evan Bouchard not only leads all defensemen in points, but he leads all forwards except for his own two teammates in the playoffs. He's just been incredible. And for the listeners who haven't been able to watch the Oilers every night, can you talk a little bit about just how good he's been?
Yeah, I think what's impressive about Bouchard is you'll look at the offensive numbers and they obviously jump off the chart. However, I actually think it's his defensive game that's improved the most this year in the postseason. And I saw it last year. I saw him, and it started a little bit with Duncan Keith. And Bouchard said Keith told him a few simple things. Number one, stay on your side of the ice. It goes, and it sounds really simple, but when you get going in a playoff game, sometimes you want to do more. And Keith was like, you stay on your side, I'll stay on mine for the most part. And then Keith just said, you know what? In the playoffs, guys are going to challenge you. And you have to be willing to stand up for yourself. You can't expect everybody else to do it. And Bouchard, I've seen a real maturation in him. He's not he's not jumping on guys, of course. But when guys come at him, he's not backing away. Right. And he'll look you in the eye. He'll stand up and I think he's going to have to, because Tkachuk and Bennett, right? They're going to be out, although they might not play with Bouchard, because Bouchard plays a lot with McDavid, right? Knobloch and Coffey, they like to almost have like the Russian five. Ekholm and Bouchard play with McDavid's line the majority of the time. And it makes sense. Why not put your best offensive defenseman with your best offensive forward? But Bouchard's, his playmaking has always been there, guys. But I think he's really improved his getting back to pucks quickly and moving the puck up, right? And obviously playing with Ekholm helps, no question. But I think Ekholm has benefited from playing with Bouchard too, because Bouchard gets the puck. Like, he's one of the best outlet passers going, right? Like he can move the puck incredibly well. And, he's been a revelation. Like, I didn't think he's going to he's got a chance to break Coffey's record, right? Like, we're talking in 2024 of breaking like some of the order great records. Like, McDavid could break Gretzky's record or tie him if he gets 6 assists in this series, right? Like, that's crazy, man. Like, Gretzky was scoring 47 points, and McDavid might score 40 points if he has a good series. Like, it's pretty impressive to watch, to be honest. And Bouchard is a big part of it that you can't overlook for the Oilers offense. And it's not just on the power play. It's his play 5-on-5 that's really improved in both ends.
Well, you mentioned Gretzky, all the records, all the Stanley Cups. He left Edmonton, went to LA, got traded, obviously. What does this playoff run mean for the future of the Oilers? Draisaitl's up after next year. McDavid's up in 2 years. Do they need to win a cup in order to keep these guys? Or do you think they enjoy Edmonton? Just the environment.
It's a great question, John, because I think,
thanks.
Because there's two ways you can say, hey, if they win, now it's like, well, I want to leave. But I've talked to so many players, and once you win one, it's like an addiction. Now you wanted the one so bad, but now that you had it, you're like, oh my God, that euphoric feeling, I want it again. right? It's like a drug in a sense, hope it's not as, dismantling as drugs are, of course. But, so, a lot of people have said if they win, does that increase the chances? I think, I look at Draisaitl, who's up first. He could go somewhere else, but he's not going to play with the best player in the world. And by the way, they don't play a ton 5-on-5 anymore, right? I think some people, they're on the power play why wouldn't you put your two best players every team in the league does it, right? But 5-on-5, they're better as a team when they're separate. Now they always play the first shift together after opposing team's power play, which I think is good coaching by Knobloch. He gets all 12 of his forwards out because he has 6 penalty killers. Then he goes to Hyman, Draisaitl, McDavid line, and then he goes his other 3 forwards, Kane, Holloway, and whichever other forward isn't killing penalties. That's what he does. So I look at Draisaitl, and I think he's going to sign a 4-year deal, right? And the reason is, and this is, now I know Edmonton fans don't like it when I say that, but I look at this from a player's perspective. The best players in the league, when they sign long-term deals, by the time the deal's done, you know what? They're a bargain. So that's great for the team and it's great for the fans. But if I'm a superstar player in the NHL, I'm looking at the NBA and saying, hey, guess what? They only have maximum 5-year deals, guys, in the NBA. Maximum. And most of those guys sign 2 or 3-year deals. So they're always getting, I'm the best guy. I want to get paid like I'm the best guy. And so if I'm Leon Draisaitl, why wouldn't I take a page of Austin Matthews' book? Hey, I'll sign a 4-year deal. A, I'm going to get good money. But B, it's not going to be crazy. He'd probably be around 13 and a half, which is what he deserves. And then the Oilers can still be competitive. And then guess what? It forces the management to say, okay, well, we would like to keep him again in 4 years. So we got to stay competitive during this time. So to me, a 4-year deal, if you asked every Oiler fan or every Oiler management, okay, I get 4 more years of Draisaitl, I'll take that over 0. So yeah, you take 4 years. And McDavid the next year, I could see him doing the same thing. I don't think Jeff Jackson comes to Edmonton, guys, without having a pretty good sense of what his former client was going to do. At least not long term. Of course, everybody in Edmonton wants, McDavid to retire there, but I can't say for sure. It's rare, right? Joe Sakic, Steve Yzerman's, those are rare. So, but if they could get another 4 years from him, right? Because if McDavid and Draisaitl stay together, and you know what, Ken Holland, and we could talk about his replacement because that's a big question too, right? How can you make sure you build around those guys? Because the great players, I've always said this, it's unfair for the best players, but best players are individuals. They get all the awards, but teams win cups. And if you don't have good support system, I don't care who your team is, you're not going to win.
Yeah, I agree. So what's the number then? He makes 8.5 now.
Yeah, I think 13 to 13.5 is what he's going to get.
And then McDavid the year after gets 15?
Yeah, probably.
It's bonkers. All right, moving on. Let's do some quick hits.
It's not bad money for them, is it, Johnny? It's not bad money for them.
That's insane money. And then, he's getting sponsorship money. That's another reason to stay in Canada. He gets so much sponsorship money. He doesn't get that amount in USA, I don't think.
Well, I'm not even sure. I read an article about Crosby's sponsorship money at its peak, and it's NHL guys are getting better, but comparatively, unless you have a shoe deal or something, right? It's hard to get huge sponsorship dollars, really.
You're not Shohei Ohtani, who doesn't even touch his $300 million deal.
That's because you're selling jerseys to everybody in your home country. That's killing it.
I know. All right, Tim. Tim does quick hits, quick answers, Jason.
Okay,
if that's possible.
Sure.
Yeah. First one, and these aren't all Oilers related, but first one is, how many games will this series go?
6.
Will Joe Pavelski be in the Hall of Fame?
No.
Should the Rangers trade Kaapo Kakko this summer?
No.
Will the Leafs trade Mitch Marner this summer?
Yes.
Wow.
Love it. Last one here. It seems like every time there's a cup final, there's a depth player, a depth defenseman, a bottom 6 forward that steps up and has a big goal, a big series. If the Oilers win the cup, who do you see that role player stepping up to be the hero?
Ooh, for the Oilers role guy to step up.
The Mike Rupp type.
I will say
2 goals, game 7, John.
Matthias Janmark.
I like it.
Who wins the cup?
I had Oilers at the start of the year, so I'll stick with them. I'll say Oilers in 6.
6. Okay. Very good. All right, Jason. Anything else?
Johnny,
any of your million podcasts you want to plug?
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm actually only on the DFO Rundown podcast with Frank, but I have my radio show on Sports 1440 and write at OilersNation.com. But now I saw your reaction about Mitch Marner. You don't think they're going to trade him?
I don't think he will allow them to trade him.
Well, you think he's going to go Matt Sundin?
Yeah, I think he's going to just no trade, no move clause. I'm staying here. I'm not leaving. And then he's going to leave in the offseason. That's what I think he's going to do.
Yeah. I don't know, man. Like, I guess so, but would you want to stay there if everybody, like, I know Torrey Krug did it in St. Louis, but do you want to, I don't know. It's an interesting point. Like, I'm not saying it's an easy trade, but I think Tree leaving, he was the guy who traded Tkachuk. And I know at the time, a lot of people thought that trade was okay. Right now, the signing of Huberdeau's contract is what's killed the trade. Yeah. But Weegar's been good. We'll see if the first round pick becomes anything or not. But for a guy who was going to leave, I thought they did okay. So I'll be curious in Marner. Like, Marner's an interesting player, guys. Like, he's a good player, but I think he's overpaid for a small winger who doesn't score goals.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's a good player. I like him. I would take him. I want him on Chicago.
Yeah, like, you want him. I think he's a good player. There's no question. You want him on your team, but and it's not his fault, but like Kyle Dubas, the minute they signed John Tavares, that screwed their whole payroll. Because now Marner and Matthews like, well, hey, we got to make as much as him. Yeah, and I get why, and that kind of screwed it.
Yeah, we'll see. It's going to be an interesting offseason. But anyways, Jason, thank you very much. I know you're busy. I appreciate you joining the show, and we'll be watching DFO Rundown, you and Frank Saravalli, and we will hopefully have you around when the Oilers win the Cup.
Johnny, anytime, Tim. John, have a great day, fellas.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll talk to you later. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Dropping the Gloves with John Scott, a member of the Nation Network of Podcasts. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from to never miss an episode.